future of Africa. Many of those conversations were important. Some were unforgettable. But there is one conversation that took place in Johannesburg during the month of January 2026 that stayed with me in a way few others ever have. It was not a discussion about elections. It was not about political parties. It was not about who would win or lose power. Instead, it became a conversation about Jesus, faith, leadership, truth, and the growing moral crisis that many people can already feel but struggle to describe. The man sitting across from me was Joshua Maponga. Many people know him as a speaker, a researcher of African history, and someone who is never afraid to challenge conventional thinking. Some admire him. Others strongly disagree with him. What cannot be denied is that he asks difficult questions. Questions that make people uncomfortable. Questions that force people to examine what they truly believe. When we met that day, our original intention was simple. We planned to discuss Africa's future. We wanted to talk about corruption, leadership failures, economic challenges, and the opportunities available to the next generation. But the conversation soon moved in a direction neither of us expected. As we spoke, we looked at the reality surrounding us. To struggle with violent crime, youth unemployment remained painfully high. Millions of families were fighting every day just to survive. Many citizens had heard promises for years, yet their lives remained unchanged. The more we discussed these realities, the more a troubling question began to form in my mind. What is really happening to the people who lead nations? Are leaders still serving the people? Or have too many become servants of their own interests? And perhaps an even deeper question emerged. Have we lost something more important than economic growth or political influence? Have we lost our moral foundation? I did not know it then, but before that meeting ended, Joshua Maponga would ask a question that would silence the entire room and leave me thinking long after the conversation was over. That question became the beginning of a discussion I believe every person should hear. Especially in a time when trust is disappearing, hope is fading, and many people are searching for answers. The conversation had already been intense. Joshua Maponga and I had spent more than an hour discussing Africa's future, the failures of leadership, and the growing frustration among ordinary citizens. Outside the meeting room, Johannesburg continued moving at its usual pace. People were working, people were struggling, people were hoping for something better. Inside that small room in Sandton, however, a very different discussion was taking shape. It was no longer about policies. It was no longer about political parties. It was becoming a conversation about conscience. Then Joshua suddenly looked directly at me and asked a question I did not expect. Julius, if Jesus returned to South Africa today, would he sit with the people or with the leaders? For a moment, nobody spoke. The room became completely silent. I had participated in countless political debates over the years. I had been challenged by journalists, opponents, and critics. But this question was different. It was not asking me for a political position. It was asking me to think about the distance between power and ordinary people. I paused for several seconds, not because I lacked an answer, but because I realized how difficult the question truly was. Joshua continued speaking. He said that many societies around the world are facing a dangerous problem. People are beginning to lose trust, not only trust in politicians, not only trust in institutions, but trust itself. He argued that trust is one of the most valuable assets any nation can possess. Without trust, communities begin to fracture. Without trust, citizens stop believing promises. Without trust, hope slowly disappears. As he spoke, I found myself reflecting on many conversations I had experienced Africa today. Where would he spend his time? Would he be sitting comfortably among powerful individuals? Or would he be listening to struggling families, unemployed youth, and forgotten communities? Whether one is religious or not, the question forces us to examine our priorities. Who are we truly serving? Whose voices are we hearing? Whose suffering are we ignoring? By this point, our conversation had moved far beyond politics. It had become a discussion about the direction of society itself. And although we had only begun, I already sensed that the questions becoming louder in that room were questions many people across Africa and beyond were asking themselves. Questions about leadership, questions about truth, questions about faith, questions about hope. What I did not realize was that Joshua was about to take the conversation even further. Because next, he would begin speaking about leaders who talk about God in public but live very differently in private. And that part of the discussion would become even more uncomfortable. After a brief pause, Joshua Maponga shifted the conversation in a direction that immediately made the room more uncomfortable. He began talking about leadership and faith. Not faith as a personal belief, not faith as a private matter, but faith as it is presented to the public. He pointed out that across Africa and many other parts of the world, countless politicians regularly appear in churches. They stand before congregations. They quote scripture. They speak about God. They ask people to pray for their nations. On the surface, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, many citizens appreciate leaders who openly acknowledge spiritual values. But Joshua's concern was not what leaders say inside churches. His concern was what happens after they leave. He asked a simple question. What does it mean when a leader speaks about honesty on Sunday but participates in corruption on Monday? What does it mean when a leader asks citizens to trust God while betraying the trust of the very people who elected him? The room grew quieter because everyone understood the point he was making. The issue was not religion. The issue was hypocrisy. Joshua argued that one of the greatest dangers facing society today is the widening gap between public image and private behavior. Many people have become experts at appearing virtuous. They know the right words. They know how to inspire crowds. They know how to create headlines. But character is revealed when cameras are gone. Character is revealed when nobody's watching. Character is revealed through decisions, not speeches. As I listened, I found it difficult to disagree. Over the years, I have seen leaders make promises that sounded inspiring. I have seen governments announce ambitious plans. I have seen officials speak passionately about serving the people, yet many communities continue struggling with the same problems year after year. Roads remain broken, schools remain underfunded, hospitals remain overcrowded, young people remain unemployed. Meanwhile, some of those entrusted with public responsibility continue living comfortably. Joshua then referred to the broader issue of corruption. Across many countries, public corruption continues to undermine development, weaken institutions, and destroy trust between governments and citizens. The damage extends far beyond money. Corruption steals opportunities, it steals confidence, it steals hope. When resources intended for the public disappear, entire communities pay the price. A child may lose access to education, a family may lose access to healthcare, a young person may lose access to employment opportunities. The consequences are real, and they often affect those who are already struggling the most. Joshua then said something that stayed with me. He said the greatest tragedy is not when corrupt people behave badly. The greatest tragedy is when people who claim to represent morality become the ones destroying it. That statement struck me deeply because societies depend on examples. Young people are always watching. They observe leaders. They observe teachers. They observe parents. They observe public figures. They pay attention to what adults reward and what adults tolerate. If honesty is rewarded, honesty grows. If integrity is respected, integrity spreads. But if dishonesty leads to wealth and influence, what lesson are future generations learning? Joshua worried that many young people have become increasingly cynical. They see powerful individuals avoiding accountability. They see promises repeatedly broken. They see people gaining advantages through connections rather than merit. Over time, they begin asking dangerous questions. Why should I follow the rules? Why should I act honestly? Why should I sacrifice for the common good? When those questions begin spreading throughout society, the consequences can last for generations. I thought about the many young South Africans I have met over the years. Some are ambitious, some are talented, Some are determined to improve their communities, but many are also frustrated. They want opportunities, they want fairness, they want proof that hard work still matters. Most importantly, they want leaders they can believe in. Not perfect leaders, but honest leaders. Leaders willing to admit mistakes. Leaders willing to place public service above personal benefit. Joshua then challenged another common assumption. He said many people believe leadership is about authority, but true leadership is actually about responsibility. The higher someone rises, the greater their obligation becomes. Power should increase accountability, not reduce it. Yet too often the opposite happens. The powerful become insulated. Criticism becomes unwelcome. Truth becomes uncomfortable. Surrounding voices begin telling leaders only what they want to hear. That is when serious mistakes begin. Because no individual, no matter how intelligent or experienced, can lead effectively while ignoring reality. History offers countless examples. Nations rarely collapse overnight. Institutions rarely fail in a single moment. Decline usually begins slowly. Small warnings are ignored. Small failures accumulate. Small compromises become accepted. Years later, society discovers that problems once considered manageable have become crises. As Joshua spoke, I realized we were no longer discussing individual politicians. We were discussing human nature itself. The temptation to place self-interest above responsibility. The temptation to seek praise instead of truth. The temptation to protect power instead of serving people. These temptations exist everywhere. They are not limited to one country, one party, or one continent. That is why the conversation felt larger than South Africa. It touched on a challenge facing societies around the world. How do we rebuild trust? How do we restore integrity? How do we encourage a generation of leaders whose actions reflect the values they publicly defend? Those questions remained hanging in the air. But Joshua was not finished. He believed the consequences of leadership failure were already visible. And nowhere was that more evident than among young people struggling to find hope for the future. That realization led us naturally into the next stage of our discussion, a discussion about the silent crisis affecting millions of young men and women across Africa. The conversation naturally shifted toward the people who will inherit the future of Africa, our youth. Joshua Maponga leaned forward and said something that immediately captured my attention. He believed that one of the greatest crises facing Africa today is not being discussed loudly enough. It is not simply unemployment. It is not simply poverty. It is not simply crime. It is the growing loss of hope among young people. At first glance, this may seem like an invisible problem. Hope cannot be measured the same way economists measure inflation. Hope does not appear in government reports. Hope does not show up in budget speeches. But when hope begins to disappear, the effects eventually become visible everywhere. Joshua argued that millions of young people are struggling to see a future for themselves. Some no longer trust politicians. Others no longer trust institutions. Many have become skeptical of promises because they have heard the same promises repeatedly without seeing meaningful change. The result is a generation that increasingly feels disconnected from the systems that are supposed to serve them. As we spoke, memories began returning to me. I thought about meetings I had attended in Limpopo. I thought about conversations in Soweto. I thought about young people I had met in Durban and other communities across South Africa. Again and again, I had similar questions. Will life ever improve for us? Will we ever find stable work? Will we ever own a home? Will our children have better opportunities than we did? These were not questions about luxury. These were questions about dignity. Questions about survival. Questions about whether effort still leads to progress. Many young people are working hard. They complete their education. They search for employment. They try to build a future. Yet too many continue facing barriers that seem impossible to overcome. When disappointment becomes constant, discouragement follows. When discouragement lasts long enough, hopelessness can take its place. Joshua warned that hopelessness is one of the most dangerous forces any society can face. A person who loses hope often stops planning for tomorrow. A person who loses hope may stop believing that positive change is possible. And when large numbers of young people begin feeling that way, entire nations face serious consequences. The issue extends beyond economy. It affects families, it affects communities, it affects social stability. A generation without hope becomes vulnerable to anger, division, crime, manipulation, and despair. That reality should concern every leader, because the future of a nation is ultimately determined by its young people. If they are thriving, the nation has reason to be optimistic. If they are struggling, the nation should pay attention. Joshua then made another observation that stayed with me. He said, many young people are searching for meaning just as much as they are searching for opportunity. They want jobs, but they also want purpose. They want income, but they also want significance. Human beings do not live on money alone. People want to believe their lives matter. They want to feel connected to something greater than themselves. When those needs go unmet, a deep emptiness can develop. I found myself agreeing with him. Many public discussions focus entirely on material issues. Those issues are important. People need food. People need housing. People need employment. But societies also need vision. They need values. They need reasons to believe that sacrifice and hard work still matter. Without those things, economic progress alone may not be enough. Joshua worries that too many young people are growing up surrounded by disappointment. They see corruption scandals, they see broken promises, they see inequality, they see opportunities concentrated among a small number of people. Over time, they begin wondering whether the system is truly working for them. Some eventually stop participating, others become angry, others simply lose faith altogether. As we discuss these realities, I found myself thinking about what Africa could become 10 years from now. The answer depends largely on the choices being made today. Will young people be equipped with opportunities? Will they be given reasons to believe in the future? Will they inherit institutions worthy of their trust? Or will they inherit deeper frustration, deeper division, and deeper disappointment? These are not questions that can be postponed indefinitely. Every year that passes makes them more urgent. Joshua then asked a question that lingered in my mind. What happens when an entire generation loses hope? The answer is uncomfortable. Economic growth becomes harder. Social stability becomes weaker. Communities become more fragile. And the future becomes less predictable. No nation can afford to ignore that reality. Not South Africa. Not Africa. Not any country in the world. As the discussion continued, it became clear that Joshua believed the solution required more than policy reforms alone. He believed societies needed to revisit certain values. Values that encourage service. Values that encourage responsibility. Values that encourage leaders to stand with ordinary people rather than above them. That belief led him to speak about Jesus in a way I had rarely heard before. Not as a religious symbol, not as a political tool, but as someone who consistently challenged injustice and stood alongside those who had been forgotten. And that perspective would take our conversation in an entirely new direction. Up to that point, our discussion had focused largely on leadership, trust, corruption, and the struggles facing young people. But then Joshua Maponga took the conversation in a direction I did not expect. He began talking about Jesus, not in the way many people usually do. He was not discussing church traditions. He was not debating denominations. He was not arguing about religious institutions. Instead, he spoke about Jesus as a figure who consistently challenged unjust systems and stood alongside those who had been pushed aside. That perspective immediately caught my attention. Joshua said that when many people think about Jesus, they often focus only on spiritual matters. But when he studies the life of Jesus, he sees someone who repeatedly confronted hypocrisy, questioned powerful authorities, and defended people who had little influence or status. He reminded me that Jesus spent much of his time among ordinary people. The poor, the sick, the forgotten, the rejected, the people society often overlooked. According to Joshua, this was not accidental. It revealed something important about leadership itself. True leadership is not measured by how many powerful people know your name. It is measured by how many vulnerable people benefit from your actions. That statement stayed with me. Because every day across South Africa, millions of people continue facing challenges that cannot be ignored. Families struggle to put food on the table. Young people search endlessly for opportunities, Communities wait for services that should have arrived years ago. Citizens continue hoping that someone will genuinely listen to them. Joshua then asked a question that forced me to think deeply. If leaders genuinely embraced the values they publicly celebrate, how different would society look? What if public service truly became service? What if responsibility mattered more than personal gain? What if protecting the vulnerable became a national priority rather than a campaign slogan? The more we explore these questions, the more uncomfortable they became, because the gap between ideals and reality is often larger than we want to admit. Many speeches sound inspiring. Many promises sound convincing. Many public statements receive applause. But ordinary people ultimately judge leadership through lived experience. A parent struggling to feed a family does not evaluate leadership through slogans. An unemployed young person does not measure success through speeches. A community facing poverty judges leadership through results. Joshua argued that one reason so many citizens feel frustrated is because they are tired of hearing beautiful words without seeing meaningful action. They have listened to promises. They have listened to explanations. They have listened to excuses. What they want now is evidence. Evidence that leaders truly understand their struggles. Evidence that someone is willing to place the needs of the people above political interests. Above political interests. Evidence that integrity still exists. As I listened, I found myself reflecting on how easily public life can become disconnected from everyday reality. People in positions of authority often spend time with other powerful individuals. They attend meetings, they discuss policies, they review reports. All of those things have value, but there is also a danger. The danger is becoming so focused on systems that you stop seeing the people those systems are meant to serve. Joshua believed Jesus represented the opposite approach. He believed Jesus constantly brought attention back to people, back to human dignity, back to compassion, back to justice, back to responsibility. Whether someone agrees with every aspect of that interpretation or not, the principle itself is difficult to dismiss. A society becomes stronger when leaders remember the people who are struggling. A society becomes healthier when power is exercised with humility. A society becomes more stable when citizens believe they matter. The conversation then turned towards South Africa specifically. Joshua pointed out that many of the challenges facing the country are not merely technical problems. They are human problems. Behind every unemployment statistic is a person. Behind every poverty figure is a family. Behind every crime statistic is a community dealing with pain and uncertainty. Numbers matter. Policies matter. Economic growth matters. But people matter most. If leaders lose sight of that reality, even the best plans can fail. I remember sitting quietly for a moment as those ideas settled in my mind, because regardless of political ideology, there was a truth in what Joshua was saying. The purpose of leadership is not simply to hold power. The purpose of leadership is to improve lives. When that goal is forgotten, trust begins to disappear. And once trust begins disappearing, rebuilding it becomes increasingly difficult. Joshua then looked at me and asked another question. What would happen if leaders spent less time protecting their image and more time serving their people? It was not a complicated question, but it was a powerful one, because the answer seemed obvious. Communities would benefit, trust would grow, citizens would feel heard, and perhaps many of the frustrations fueling social tension would begin to ease. By this stage, our discussion had moved far beyond theology. It had become a conversation about values. Values that influence leadership. Values that shape societies. Values that determine whether nations move toward unity or division. Yet, Joshua believed another major threat was already placing enormous pressure on those values. Economic hardship, rising costs, growing desperation. And as we turned our attention toward the latest economic realities facing ordinary families, the conversation became even more serious. After discussing leadership, values, and the example Joshua believed Jesus represented, our attention turned towards something far more concrete. Numbers, statistics, economic realities, the things ordinary families face every single day. Joshua opened several recent reports and began reviewing the challenges confronting millions of people across South Africa. The figures were troubling. Food prices continued placing pressure on household budgets. Electricity costs remained a burden for many families. Fuel expenses affected transportation, business activity, and the price of everyday goods. Housing costs continued consuming large portions of family income. For many citizens, life was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Joshua looked at the data for a moment and then asked a question. How long can a nation remain stable when more and more people feel trapped? The question was simple, but it carried enormous weight because economic hardship affects more than bank accounts. It affects relationships. It affects mental health. It affects confidence in the future. It affects the way people view their leaders and institutions. I thought about families living paycheck to paycheck, people who wake up every morning determined to work hard and provide for their loved ones. Many are not asking for luxury. They are not asking for special treatment. They simply want a fair opportunity to build a decent life. Yet for millions, that goal feels increasingly distant. Joshua pointed out that prolonged financial pressure changes the way people think. When survival becomes the primary concern, long-term planning becomes difficult. People begin focusing only on the next bill, the next meal, the next month, the next crisis. Hope gradually gives way to anxiety, and anxiety eventually creates frustration. That frustration can spread throughout an entire society. As we continue talking, Joshua emphasized that economic hardship alone is not necessarily fatal to a nation. History shows that countries can recover from recessions. They can rebuild after setbacks. They can overcome difficult periods. What concerned him was something deeper. He worried about what happens when an economic crisis slowly transforms into a moral crisis. He explained that when people lose confidence in the future, they sometimes become more willing to compromise their values. Desperation can create dangerous temptations. A struggling official may justify corruption. A struggling business owner may cut ethical corners. A struggling citizen may begin believing that honesty no longer matters. Little by little, financial pressure can erode moral foundations. That observation caught my attention because economic statistics rarely tell the whole story. A report may reveal rising prices. A survey may reveal unemployment. A budget may reveal deficits. But none of those numbers fully capture the emotional and psychological impact on ordinary people. Behind every statistic is a human being. A mother worried about feeding her children. A father concerned about paying bills. A graduate unable to find work. A retiree struggling to stretch limited resources. The numbers tell part of the story, people tell the rest. Joshua then asked another difficult question. What happens when citizens begin losing faith not only in the economy but also in each other? Again, the room became quiet because trust is essential to every society. Trust allows communities to function. Trust allows businesses to invest. Trust allows institutions to operate. Trust allows citizens to believe tomorrow can be better than today. Without trust, fear grows. Without trust, division grows. Without trust, instability becomes more likely. As I reflected on his words, I realized that economic issues and moral issues are often more connected than we assume. When people feel secure, they are more likely to think about the future. They are more likely to invest in their communities. They are more likely to believe that hard work will be rewarded. But when uncertainty dominates everyday life, a very different mindset can emerge. People begin asking whether the system is fair, whether leaders understand their struggles, whether anyone is truly looking out for their interests. Joshua believed these questions were becoming increasingly common across Africa and many other parts of the world. Citizens were not only demanding economic progress, they were demanding accountability. They were demanding honesty. They were demanding leadership they could trust. The more we examined the data, the clearer one reality became. The crisis facing many societies is not purely financial, it is also a crisis of confidence. People want reasons to believe, reasons to hope, reasons to trust that their sacrifices today can produce a better tomorrow. Without those reasons, even positive economic changes may fail to restore public confidence. As our conversation continued, Joshua's tone became more direct. He believed many leaders were aware of these realities. Yet too often they preferred hearing praise instead of uncomfortable truths. And according to him, that tendency might be one of the greatest dangers facing leadership today. That observation would lead us into one of the most challenging parts of our entire discussion. A discussion about the truths many leaders simply do not want to hear. By this stage of the conversation, Joshua Maponga had already raised difficult questions about trust, leadership, faith, and the future of young people. But he was not finished. In many ways, the most uncomfortable part of our discussion was still ahead. Joshua leaned back for a moment and said something that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. Many leaders love praise more than they love truth. Nobody responded right away because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Compliments are easy to accept. Praise feels good. Approval is comforting, but truth can be painful, especially when that truth exposes mistakes, weaknesses, or failures. Joshua argued that one of the greatest dangers of power is that it can slowly isolate people from reality. The longer someone remains in a position of influence, the greater the temptation to surround themselves with individuals who only tell them what they want to hear. Critics are ignored. Warnings are dismissed. Uncomfortable facts are pushed aside. Gradually, leaders begin living inside an environment where praise becomes more common than honesty. History shows how dangerous that can be. Many crises did not occur because leaders lacked information. They occurred because leaders ignored information. Warnings were available. Experts spoke up. Citizens raised concerns, but those concerns were not taken seriously until it was too late. Joshua believed this pattern repeats itself throughout history. Nations rarely encounter disaster without warning. Problems usually announce themselves long before they become emergencies. The challenge is whether leaders are willing to listen. As I considered his words, I realized there was truth in that observation. Every society produces people willing to point out problems. Journalists raise questions. Community leaders raise concerns. Religious leaders offer warnings. Ordinary citizens share their frustrations. The issue is not whether warnings exist. The issue is whether anyone pays attention. Joshua then turned the conversation to what ordinary families. They say that many citizens are constantly being asked to remain patient. They are told that improvements are coming. They are told that reforms require time. They are told that solutions are being developed. Sometimes those statements are true. Real change often does take time. But Joshua's concern was different. He worried about what happens when patience becomes a permanent request. How many years can struggling families wait? How many years can unemployed young people wait? How many years can communities continue hearing promises without seeing results? Those questions cannot be ignored forever. Because while governments debate policies, people continue living their lives. Children continue growing up. Parents continue aging. Opportunities continue disappearing. Time continues moving forward. Joshua said something that struck me deeply. The people waiting for change do not have unlimited time. That sentence stayed with me because it reflected a reality that is often forgotten. For many citizens, politics is not an intellectual exercise. It is not a television debate. It is not a social media argument. It is daily life. It is whether food can be placed on the table. It is whether children can receive a quality education. It is whether a family can feel secure about tomorrow. When viewed from that perspective, leadership carries enormous responsibility. Every decision affects real people. Every delay affects real people. Every failure affects real people. Joshua believed many leaders lose sight of this reality after spending too much time focused on power itself. Instead of asking what citizens need, they begin asking what protects their position. Instead of seeking truth, they seek comfort. Instead of welcoming accountability, they resist it. And that is where serious problems begin. Because accountability is not the enemy of leadership. It is one of its foundations. A leader who cannot accept criticism eventually loses the ability to learn. A leader who cannot hear difficult truths eventually loses contact with reality. A leader who values loyalty above honesty risks making decisions based on illusion rather than fact. As our conversation continued, I found myself reflecting on examples from around the world. Many powerful institutions appeared strong until suddenly they were not. Many leaders appeared secure until public confidence disappeared. Many systems seemed stable until years of ignored problems finally caught up with them. The lesson seemed clear. Strength is not demonstrated by avoiding criticism. Strength is demonstrated by confronting reality honestly. Joshua then asked another question. What happens if leaders continue ignoring the frustrations of ordinary people? What happens if citizens continue feeling unheard? What happens if trust continues declining year after year? The answers were troubling. More division, more anger, more cynicism, more people losing confidence in the future. And once that process gains momentum, reversing it becomes increasingly difficult. The conversation had now moved far beyond politics. It had become a discussion about responsibility. Responsibility to tell the truth. Responsibility to listen. Responsibility to place the needs of people above personal comfort. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt unusually quiet. Then Joshua surprised me with a question that was no longer about governments, institutions, or public policy. It was a question directed at me personally. A question about life itself. A question about conscience. And when he asked it, I found myself thinking more deeply than I had at any point during the entire conversation. After spending so much time discussing leaders, institutions, corruption, economic pressure, and the future of society, I assumed Joshua Maponga would continue speaking about public issues. Instead, he suddenly made the conversation personal, very personal. He looked directly at me and asked a question I did not see coming. Julius, if today were your last day alive, what would you be most proud of? For the first time that day, I found myself completely silent. Not because I did not understand the question, but because I understood it too well. It was not a political question. It was not about elections. It was not about influence. It was not about success. It was a question about conscience. A question that stripped away titles, positions, and public reputation. A question that forced me to think about what truly matters when everything else is removed. For several moments, I did not answer. My mind began reviewing years of experiences, victories, defeats, decisions, arguments, achievements, mistakes. Public life often moves so quickly that people rarely stop and ask themselves such questions. There is always another meeting, another speech, another campaign, another crisis, another headline. Life becomes a constant movement forward. Yet Joshua's question forced me to stop, to look inward rather than outward. And perhaps that is why it felt so powerful. Most people spend a great deal of time evaluating others. We analyze leaders. We criticize governments. We judge institutions. But how often do we honestly evaluate ourselves? How often do we ask whether we are becoming the kind of people we intended to be? Joshua then said something that deepened the discussion even further. He suggested that many people avoid these questions because they are uncomfortable. It is easier to focus on the failures of others. It is easier to point toward external problems. It is much harder to examine our own choices, our own priorities, our own responsibilities. The room remained quiet because everyone understood that this conversation had moved beyond politics entirely. Joshua was now talking about the human condition, about the tendency people have to postpone important reflections. Many assume there will always be more time to change, more time to repair relationships, more time to correct mistakes, more time to pursue what truly matters. But life offers no guarantees. None of us know how much time we have. That reality makes certain questions impossible to ignore. If today were the final chapter of our story, what would we be remembered for? Would it be our possessions? Would it be our titles? Would it be our wealth? Or would it be something deeper? The lives we impacted, the truth we defended, the people we helped, the principles we refused to abandon. Joshua believed that faith becomes meaningful precisely at this point. Not when it is merely discussed, not when it is displayed publicly, but when it forces individuals to confront themselves honestly, to ask difficult questions, to evaluate their own character, to consider whether their actions align with their beliefs. As I listened, I realized that this challenge applies to everyone: leaders, business owners, workers, parents, young people, retirees. Every human being eventually faces questions that no title can answer. Questions about purpose, questions about integrity, questions about legacy, questions about whether we have lived according to our values. Joshua then asked something else. How many people go through life without ever confronting these questions? How many remain busy for decades without stopping to consider what truly matters? And if they never ask those questions, what happens when reality finally forces them to? The thought was unsettling, because modern life often encourages distraction. People chase success, they chase recognition, they chase comfort, they chase endless goals, yet many rarely pause long enough to ask where those pursuits are leading. Joshua believed that one of the greatest dangers facing society is not ignorance, it is neglect. Neglecting the questions that shape character, neglecting the values that guide decisions, neglecting the truths that determine whether a life has meaning beyond personal achievement. The more I reflected on his words, the more I understood why the conversation felt different from any political discussion I had experienced. Political debates often focus on changing systems. Joshua was talking about changing people, because institutions are ultimately built by people. Governments are run by people, communities are shaped by people. If individuals lose their moral compass, eventually the institutions around them begin reflecting that loss. That realization stayed with me. Perhaps the future of a nation depends not only on policies and economics. Perhaps it also depends on whether individuals are willing to confront themselves honestly, whether they are willing to live according to the values they claim to believe, whether they are willing to choose truth even when it is uncomfortable. As our discussion continued, Joshua made it clear that these questions were not only relevant to individuals. He believed they were relevant to Africa itself, because in his view, the continent was approaching a historic crossroads, a moment that would help determine the future of generations yet to come. And his warning about that future was impossible to ignore. After asking difficult questions about leadership, morality, faith, and personal responsibility, Joshua Maponga turned his attention to the future of Africa itself. His tone became more serious, not dramatic, not emotional, simply serious. It was the tone of someone who believed that decisions being made today would shape the lives of millions of people tomorrow. Joshua said he believed Africa was standing at a historic crossroads, a moment of choice. A moment that future generations may one day look back upon and ask whether their leaders recognized the opportunity before them. According to him, there were two possible paths ahead. One path led toward greater accountability, greater responsibility, greater transparency, greater commitment to serving ordinary citizens. The other path led toward deeper corruption, deeper frustration, and deeper instability. Neither path was guaranteed. Both depended on the choices people were making right now. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about how often nations assume they will always continue moving forward. History tells a different story. No country is guaranteed success. No society is immune from decline. No institution lasts forever simply because it exists today. Joshua reminded me that nations rarely collapse in a single moment. They do not usually fail because of one event. One election, one scandal, one mistake. Most decline happens gradually. Small warnings are ignored. Small problems are postponed. Small compromises become normal. Year after year, the damage accumulates. Then one day people suddenly ask what went wrong. The truth is that the warning signs were often visible all along. They were simply ignored. That observation resonated with me because many of the challenges facing Africa today did not appear overnight. Corruption did not appear overnight. Unemployment did not appear overnight. Poverty did not appear overnight. Institutional weaknesses did not appear overnight. These issues developed over many years, which means solving them will also require time, commitment, and honesty. Joshua believed one of the greatest mistakes leaders make is assuming that future generations will automatically fix today's problems. He disagreed with that idea. He argued that every generation inherits both opportunities and consequences. The decisions made today become the realities experienced tomorrow. If leaders strengthen institutions today, future generations benefit. If leaders weaken institutions today, future generations pay the price. The principle seemed simple, yet its implications were enormous, because every decision carries consequences beyond the present moment. Joshua then asked another question. If leaders continue placing personal interest above public interest, what kind of Africa will exist 20 years from now? The room became quiet again, because nobody could dismiss the question. Across the continent, millions of young people are preparing to become tomorrow's workers, parents, entrepreneurs, teachers, and leaders. They will inherit the systems being built today. They will inherit the successes, but they will also inherit the failures. That reality creates a profound responsibility for everyone currently in positions of influence. Joshua believed Africa possesses extraordinary potential, vast natural resources, a young population, entrepreneurial energy, cultural strength, resilience, creativity, determination. The continent has no shortage of talent. In his view, the greatest challenge was not a lack of resources. It was whether leadership would be strong enough to convert potential into progress, whether truth would be valued more than convenience, whether responsibility would be valued more than personal enrichment, whether long-term development would be prioritized over short-term political gain. As I listened, I realized that this was not merely an African question. Every nation faces similar choices. Every society must decide what kind of future it wants to build. Every generation must decide what values it will leave behind. Joshua then made an observation that was difficult to argue against. He said, societies often pay a heavy price when leaders focus only on immediate advantages. Short-term thinking can produce short-term victories, but it rarely produces lasting prosperity. Lasting progress requires patience, discipline, integrity, and a willingness to make difficult decisions even when they are unpopular. Those qualities are not always rewarded immediately, yet history repeatedly shows their importance. The conversation had now reached a point where politics, economics, leadership, and faith were all connected, not because they were identical, but because they all depended on one essential ingredient. Truth. Without truth, leaders lose credibility. Without truth, institutions lose legitimacy. Without truth, citizens lose confidence. Without truth, societies become vulnerable. Joshua believed Africa's future would largely depend on whether enough people were willing to confront reality honestly. Not the reality they wished existed, the reality that actually existed. Only then could meaningful change occur. Only then could trust begin to return. Only then could future generations inherit something stronger than what exists today. As the meeting slowly approached its conclusion, I thought we had already explored every major issue. I was wrong, because before we left that room, Joshua delivered one final statement. A statement so simple that it could easily be overlooked, yet so powerful that it stayed in my mind for weeks afterward. It was a sentence about truth, a sentence about leadership, a sentence about Africa, and it became the one thing I could not stop thinking about long after our conversation had ended. As our conversation approached its end, the atmosphere in the room felt different from when we had started. Hours earlier, we had planned to discuss Africa's future, leadership, corruption, and development. We had done all of that, but somewhere along the way, the discussion became much deeper. It became a conversation about truth, about responsibility, about faith, about the kind of society we are building for future generations. For a few moments, neither Joshua Maponga nor I spoke. The room was quiet. Everyone seemed lost in thought. Then Joshua looked at me and delivered a statement that was remarkably simple. There were no dramatic words, no complicated theories, no political slogans. Just one sentence. The greatest problem facing Africa is not a lack of resources, it is a lack of people willing to live according to the truth. When he said those words, something about them stayed with me. Perhaps it was because they challenged a common assumption. For years, many discussions about Africa have focused on resources. People talk about minerals, they talk about land, they talk about investment, they talk about economic growth after our conversation had ended. As our conversation approached its end, the atmosphere in the room felt different from when we had started. Hours earlier, we had planned to discuss Africa's future, leadership, corruption, and development. We had done all of that, but somewhere along the way, the discussion became much deeper. It became a conversation about truth, about responsibility, about faith, about the kind of society we are building for future generations. For a few moments, neither Joshua Maponga nor I spoke. The room was quiet. Everyone seemed lost in thought. Then Joshua looked at me and delivered a statement that was remarkably simple. There were no dramatic words, no complicated theories, no political slogans. Just one sentence. The greatest problem facing Africa is not a lack of resources, it is a lack of people willing to live according to the truth. When he said those words, something about them stayed with me. Perhaps it was because they challenged a common assumption. For years, many discussions about Africa have focused on resources. People talk about minerals, they talk about land, they talk about investment, they talk about economic growth, and those conversations matter. Resources matter, development matters, infrastructure matters. But Joshua believed something even more important was often being ignored. Character, integrity, truth. Without those things, even the greatest resources can be wasted. Without those things, opportunities can be lost. Without those things, entire generations can be disappointed. As I left that meeting and returned to my normal responsibilities, I found myself thinking about his statement again and again. I thought about leaders, not only political leaders, business leaders, religious leaders, community leaders, parents, teachers, every person who influences others in some way. How many of us are truly willing to follow the truth when it becomes uncomfortable? How many are willing to admit mistakes? How many are willing to place principles above personal benefit? How many are willing to sacrifice short-term advantages for long-term good? Those questions followed me for weeks. Because the more I thought about them, the more I realized that many of Africa's challenges are connected to them. Corruption survives when truth is ignored. Injustice survives when truth is ignored. Broken institutions survive when truth is ignored. False promises survive when truth is ignored. The absence of truth creates space for almost every other problem to grow. Joshua also made me think about ordinary citizens, not just leaders, everyone. Because truth is not only a responsibility for people in government, it is a responsibility for society as a whole. A culture of honesty cannot be created by leaders alone. It requires citizens who value honesty, families who teach honesty, communities that reward honesty, institutions that protect honesty. Without that foundation, progress becomes fragile. As the days passed, I continued reflecting on the future of South Africa. I thought about the young people searching for opportunities. I thought about families struggling with economic pressure. I thought about communities hoping for better leadership. And I kept returning to the same question. Do we still have time to change course? Do we still have time to rebuild trust? Do we still have time to strengthen the values that hold societies together? I believe those questions matter now more than ever. Because history shows that warnings should never be ignored. Problems rarely disappear simply because people refuse to discuss them. Challenges rarely solve themselves. The longer serious issues remain unaddressed, the greater the cost eventually becomes. Joshua believed Africa was receiving many warnings. Warnings about corruption, warnings about inequality, warnings about declining trust, warnings about growing frustration among the youth, warnings about leadership failures. The question was whether enough people were willing to listen. And perhaps that same question applies far beyond Africa. Around the world, many societies are wrestling with similar concerns. Citizens are losing confidence in institutions. Communities are becoming divided. People are searching for leaders they can trust. Many are asking whether truth still matters. Many are asking whether integrity still matters. Many are asking whether hope still exists. That is why Joshua's final statement continued echoing in my mind. Not because it provided an easy solution, but because it identified a difficult reality. Resources alone cannot save a nation. Speeches alone cannot save a nation. Promises alone cannot save a nation. A nation becomes stronger when enough people are willing to live according to the truth, even when doing so is difficult. As I thought about everything we had discussed that day, one final question continued returning to me. If faith becomes nothing more than a slogan, if truth becomes negotiable, if leaders stop serving the people, if citizens lose hope, then what happens next? And more importantly, are we willing to change before that question answers itself? After that conversation, I spent a great deal of time reflecting on everything that had been said and everything the world is experiencing today. I realized that regardless of where we come from, what language we speak, or what beliefs we hold, people everywhere are searching for many of the same things. They are searching for dignity, they are searching for justice, they are searching for truth, make promises that inspired millions. I have seen leaders speak confidently about the future. Yet I have also seen how difficult it is to improve people's lives when trust has been broken and when ordinary citizens feel forgotten. It's become increasingly clear to me. No nation can truly become strong while large numbers of its people remain trapped in poverty, fear, hope. Economic growth alone is not enough. Political victories alone are not enough. Public speeches alone are not enough. Real progress happens when people begin placing truth above convenience, responsibility above self-interest, and service above personal gain. That is why I believe genuine change does not begin inside government buildings. It does not begin with headlines. It does not begin with applause. It begins when ordinary men and women choose to live according to their conscience. It begins when people have the courage for what is right, even when it is difficult. It begins when leaders remember that their responsibility is to serve rather than to be served. And it begins when citizens refuse to lose hope, even during challenging times. I hope future generations will inherit a better world than the one we see today. A world where people are respected because of their character rather than their status. A world where unity is stronger than division. A world where compassion is stronger than greed. A world where truth is valued more than appearances. The road ahead will not always be easy. Every generation faces its own challenges. Every nation faces difficult choices. But I still believe that people who stand together, protect their dignity, and remain committed to the truth possess power to change their future. Because in the end, hope does not belong to those who wait for miracles. Hope belongs to those who continue working, continue believing, and continue fighting for a better tomorrow. And if this conversation has given you something to think about, I encourage you to share your thoughts and continue this discussion with others. The future is not built by one leader, one movement, or one generation alone. It is built by people who refuse to surrender their values and who remain committed to creating a more just, compassionate, and hopeful world for those who come after them.